Chapter 5 Lifetime Chances. For the first time in my life, I started completing homework assignments and participating in classroom exercises. I promised Principal Wesley months earlier that I would stay in school and attend class for the remainder of the academic year. I was finally on track to realize that promise. This achievement did not change what I was faced with on a daily basis. I was still homeless, still poor, and continued to sell drugs. Unlike most drug dealers, I never really had an entrepreneurial spirit. The hope of getting rich by any means was not my modus operandi. I could have sold drugs and made a lot more money, but I was at war with myself the entire time I sold crack. I often pondered the hard life I was living on the street without shelter, a direct result of my mother's drug addiction. I wondered why I would look to the same antagonist that was destroying our lives as a way to help rebuild it. Evil conception cannot produce good results. Terrence's depiction of us living the good life after he got his settlement was nothing more than a fantasy. As time progressed, my mother began to realize this as well. They began to smoke crack and drink more frequently. Now that Terrence had gained my mother's trust and part of mine, he became comfortable. He decided to show us the Terrence he was too clever to reveal at first. During this time, I got together with a good friend of mine and expanded my drug operation to Memphis. The city's population is much larger than Glendale, Cherry Hill, Dover, and Allen, which were some of the areas where I sold crack. Blacks and I were very close friends, and I learned a lot of things from him. I learned about the dope game and what it meant to be a gangster, or a real nigga. Blacks knew all about my living situation, including my mother's addiction and that she was a victim of domestic violence. He was cool, charismatic, and I enjoyed hanging with him. One day, we went to a guy's house in Memphis to buy 4 ounces of cocaine. When we arrived, Blacks asked me if I had a gun. When I told him that I did not, he instructed me to stay in the car. I watched as Blacks pulled out a chrome pistol, a .357 Magnum, from underneath his seat and placed it in the small of his back. I asked him, "Why in the hell are you taking that shit? It ain't even loaded." Blacks replied that he knew that it was not loaded, but asked me sarcastically if the dude inside the house knew that. At that, I smiled and sat there feeling like a young rookie in street life compared to Blacks. We were parked in front of the home of Raymond White, aka One Eye. His yard looked like a pit bull kennel. He had dogs everywhere. Blacks exited the vehicle and went inside and came back a few minutes later with the cocaine. I eyeballed it cautiously to make sure it was roughly 4 ounces. I did not have a scale, so that was the best I could do. Plus, Blacks reassured me that One Eye had waited inside. We left One Eye's house and went back to the Trap, a house dedicated exclusively for cooking and distributing crack, to divide the product in half. Blacks took 2 ounces and gave me 2. We tested our product on a couple of crack addicts by giving each of them a hit, about $3 worth of crack. After they finished smoking it, they confirmed that we had a good product. The night was young, and it was time to set up shop, get the word out that we had the most potent product in the area. We hung out on the block, drank a couple of Heinekens, and sold as much crack as we could. Several hours passed, and we decided to retire for the night. A couple of days later, I went to my grandmother's house to visit her and my Uncle Andrew. When I walked inside, they were watching the evening news as they usually did, so I joined them. The news reporter said that there had been a double homicide the day before in Glendale. There had also been several home invasions, resulting in the severe injury of one homeowner. We were shocked that such a horrific and tragic event had taken place on the good side of Glendale, as it is a small community and nothing of this magnitude had ever happened. The reporter went on to state that the 5 perpetrators' original plan was to drive from Memphis to Glendale to rob a reputed drug dealer, commonly known as Big Boy. When the 5 arrived at the Glendale residence where they believed Big Boy lived, they discovered that he was not there. The situation escalated when one of the 5 men shot and wounded a man inside the home, and then inadvertently shot one of his own. The suspects reportedly fled the scene in their van, but before they could leave Glendale, they crashed into another vehicle. All 5 men climbed out of the windows of their van and fled into a nearby wooded area, getting separated in the process. In their desperation to get back to Memphis, 3 of the men invaded a nearby home in an attempt to obtain a vehicle. They approached the homeowner and demanded he drive them to Memphis. When he refused, they attempted to steal this truck. When they had trouble starting it, one of the suspects began severely beating the man with a claw hammer, ripping off one of his ears in the process. In the meantime, the 2 other suspects managed to start the victim's truck and escape in it, leaving behind their fellow criminal. Left behind by his cohorts, the lone suspect then proceeded to the next house, where the mother of the man he had just beaten resided. At the second home, the elderly woman was thrown to the ground, breaking her wrist. When the suspect was unable to find the keys to her truck, he moved on to the next house. There, he encountered an elderly couple that had been married for 45 years. By kidnapping the two and stealing their car, the suspect was finally able to leave Glendale. Later, the Memphis Fire Department and police were alerted to the couple's car, which was on fire. After extinguishing the flames, the couple's badly burned bodies were found in the back seat. Both had been shot multiple times at close range. In conclusion, all but one of the 5 suspects had been arrested and taken into custody. The suspect at large was the one responsible for the violence. Suddenly, a picture of the suspect identified as Raymond One-Eye White was displayed on the television screen. I was stunned. This was the same guy Blacks and I had gotten our work, crack, from a few days earlier. I wanted so badly to tell them that I knew this lunatic and that I had been at his house a couple of days prior to the incident. Of course, I did not tell them anything, but sat there and acted as if I did not recognize him. Now, I fully understand why Blacks wanted some sort of protection whenever we did business with One-Eye. Normally, when a drug dealer is dealing in small weights, less than a half a kilo of cocaine, but that is relative, there was not a real need to stay strapped, armed with a pistol or assault rifle or whatever weapon one can get his hands on. I sat in Medea's living room with her and Uncle Andrew and started thinking about how this terrible event happened. I was appalled at how inhumane we humans can become in our selfish acts of rage and violence. The couple that One-Eye had reportedly killed was one of many across the nation who had become victims of a senseless act of violence. This grieved me. I hated violence just as much as I hated selling drugs, but I felt that I had no other reasonable alternative. Later, I called Blacks and asked if he had heard about what happened. He told me that he was aware. This sort of drug-related violence occurs every day, and it can happen anywhere and at any time. The next day, I met up with Blacks in the trap house to cook some crack. Later that day, I received an alarming phone call from a relative telling me that Terrence had just beaten my mother severely. I was told that she was walking around town with a pair of sunshades on her face and would not let anyone see her face. I knew that she normally wore shades whenever she had been beaten, so my heart began to race. My mind was clouded and I could not think clearly. I was in shock. I could not imagine this guy putting his hands on my mother after he had witnessed my attempted murder of the last man that had assaulted her. Now, I was infuriated. I asked how badly Terrence had beaten her. I was told that my mother could not see because her eyes were swollen shut. I cried out loud and Blacks watched silently as I wept nonstop. I hung up and called my grandmother to ask if she knew of my mother's whereabouts. Unsure, she thought my mother might be in Allen. Blacks and I discussed what had happened and I asked him to drive me to Allen so I could kill Terrence. Caught off guard, Blacks asked me if I was serious. He proceeded to caution me about the repercussions and consequences that would follow my actions. He reminded me of what had happened some time ago when I faced the possibility of being convicted for murdering Gregory. Blacks remarked, "So you want to kill him? Just like that? You will be looking at some serious time. Don't you already have a pending case?" I understood fully. At this point, I hadn't seen my 15th birthday, and this was my second time deciding to murder someone. Blacks and I discussed letting everything die down before I killed Terrence, so I would not be a primary suspect or, more desirably, a suspect at all. Although he made perfect sense, I strongly disagreed with him. I did not want to wait years or even months before killing Terrence. I could not wait that long. I had to deal with him right away. I already had my gun with me. Unlike any other time when I did dirt, criminal activities such as serious felony crimes and misdemeanors, I was not concerned about having a ski mask and the lights to conceal my identity. I did not care if people knew that I had murdered Terrence. Blacks parked his primary car since it was registered to him, and we switched to a stolen 1978 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. This was the same car I had bought from him a few months earlier. It was also my first vehicle. My grandmother had gotten suspicious of it, so I had resold it back to him. Only God knows to whom it was registered legally. The Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme was ideal, given that we needed a car the police could not trace back to either of us. We stopped in Cherry Hill on our way to Allen to see if Terrence was there. The first place I went was the corner store where all the drug addicts and dealers conducted business in the parking lot. I got out of the car, wearing a radiant smile. I fist pounded and shook hands with several acquaintances. As I was performing, I was scanning the crowd for Terrence. A few people asked how my mother was doing. Some asked what I planned to do to Terrence for hurting her. I told them that I forgave him and assured them that I was a changed man. I went into the store and asked Terrence's grandmother if she had seen him. She said no. I got back into the car and told Blacks that Terrence was not there. We drove away and continued to look for him. I went to Terrence's grandfather's house and knocked on the door. His grandfather came to the door and opened it a tiny bit. I reached my arm in through the small crack and shook his hand. I looked past him into his living room and asked him if Terrence was there. He told me that Terrence had moved back to Memphis. From there, we drove to Terrence's brother's house. When we spoke, he told me that he did not know where Terrence was. I was getting frustrated, as all of my attempts to find Terrence were fruitless. It was starting to seem as if the likelihood of me taking Terrence's life that day would be impossible. I even went to the old rundown shack that my mother and I stayed in from time to time with Terrence. This was going to be my last stop for the day. Once I arrived, I got out of the car and approached the home. Blacks waited for me in the roadway with his car idling and the gear in drive. My pistol was in the small of my back as it had been the entire time I had been speaking with Terrence's relatives. I opened the doorway and called out for him in an unassuming friendly way. "Yo, Terrence. Hey, Terrence. Are you here, man?" I mumbled "shit" in anguish and realized he may not be home. After searching the entire house, I was satisfied that he was not there. I walked back to the roadway where Blacks was waiting and told him to take me to my grandmother's house. We pulled into the driveway, and I told him I would hook up with him later. Before he left, he told me he would continue looking for Terrence for me. I thanked him and walked into my grandmother's yard, where I saw her sitting on the front porch. She whispered, "Brad, come here, Brad. I got something to tell you." As I walked closer, she said, "Go inside and check on your mama. It's a shame before God how bad that man beat her." I was asking Medea how long my mother had been there when, at that moment, my mother walked slowly outside, hardly moving her arms or neck. It was obvious that she could not bear the pain her body was in. She was wearing her sunshades. As always, I hated those sunshades because I knew that once she took them off, I would see her bruised face. This time, however, her face was swollen so badly that wearing those shades did little to hide her injuries. When my mother looked at me, I burst into tears. "Brandon, why are you crying? I fought that motherfucker back. That's right. I fought his ass back, baby." I asked her to take off her glasses so I could see her entire face. Once the shades were off, I could hardly recognize her, as it was peeling off a new skin and exposing an old wound. She tried to make light of it by being enthusiastic about being able to see a little out of one of her eyes. Although she said it was not so bad, the fact remained that we knew it was very bad. She walked inside the house and slowly made her way towards the bathroom. I followed her inside and watched as she stood in the doorway, looking in the mirror. I stood with her as she strained to examine the bruises on her face out of the eye she was able to reopen. We studied her blackened, swollen eyes and bloody nose. My mother had been brutally trampled. Her whole face suffered bruises and deep scratch marks and lacerations. We stood there for a while, motionless, without speaking. It was the silence of that moment that spoke to us. It told us it would heal us from the constant battery and beatings of life. My mother began to cry, and I wept right along with her. I tried to be strong and hold it inside, but I could not stop the tears from flowing. She would stop crying for a time and seconds later burst into tears again. It was a sort of therapy that released all of our anger, rage, hurt, and pain. To the women reading this story, in all honesty, have you ever worn my mother's shades? If so, the next time you are wearing them, take them off and look in the mirror. Now ask yourself a question and answer it honestly. Are those birthmarks or scars all over your face? Domestic violence is one of the leading causes of injury to women, more than car accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. According to the Violence Against Women, a majority staff report, Committee on the Judiciary, United States Senate, 102nd Congress, October 1992, page 3. To my understanding, this was the worst my mother had ever been beaten. We sat together and she told me the entire story. My mother and Terrence had gone to a bar in Allen. They had just arrived and were outside when he started yelling at her. Then he attacked her. Terrence's brother, Ken, ran out of the bar and stopped him. After Ken went back inside, Terrence started assaulting her again. This time, he knocked her onto the ground by striking her in the head with his fist. Once she fell down, Terrence kicked her several times. She begged him to stop, but he continued stomping and kicking her while shouting brutal insults. She said that a bystander intervened, but was unable to stop Terrence. She blacked out during the rest of his attack, but somehow managed to get off the ground at one point. She had a knife and pulled it out. Defending herself, she stabbed him in the abdomen with a 7-inch blade, concluding his vicious assault. Terrence was quickly taken to the emergency room and later flown to a hospital in Memphis. My mother talked to me about her plans to move forward and vowed not to stay in a relationship with an abusive man. She assured me of this and I supported her decision. I asked her if she knew where Terrence was living in Memphis. She responded by requesting that I not harm or kill him. Mother knew that I would have killed Terrence had I been given the chance. That would have been as natural for me as drinking a glass of water. Just like blacks, she referred back to the incident with Gregory. I assured her that it was over and did not plan on looking for Terrence anymore. My mother went to the Glendale Police Department to see if the authorities in Allen had issued a warrant for her arrest. She was advised that the Allen police had not alerted them, nor had they issued a warrant. They advised my mother that if the authorities in Allen issued a warrant for her arrest, someone would be in contact with her. Weeks had passed and there was no sign of Terrence. I waited for him like a child waiting on his father to return from a long trip. I thought that maybe one day he would slip up and return. I did count on him to believe that a lapse of time would mitigate his wrongdoing, but he never made that mistake. I suppose he knew, as most did, that he would have lost his life if he ever came within my reach. I contemplated looking for him in Memphis, but eventually decided not to. I was not familiar with the entire city and did not have the money or time to invest. Who knew school supplies and new school clothes were so expensive? Nevertheless, my mother fully recovered and the soreness of her beaten body subsided. She stopped staying in the old abandoned house in Allen, where she used to live with Terrence. She came back to Glendale and moved back with old man Cooper again. She and I had spent the night there many times before. Several of her friends were still living there as well. When I was not staying there, I spent the night in Medea's old shack and kept living my dangerous lifestyle. While living the street life, I picked up a few habits from different people. One person who influenced me greatly was my cousin, an ex-convict I would call Slim. He used to lift weights as if his life depended upon it. This guy worked out like he was a professional athlete. I asked him why he exerted so much time and energy into weightlifting. Slim told me he had to stay fit because of his gangster lifestyle, and he encouraged me to do the same. He explained how either one of us could end up in jail any day, or be attacked by rival drug dealers, or by some random guy trying to make a name for himself. He wanted to be prepared for the worst at all times. Judging from the looks of it, he was doing a damn good job preparing. Slim looked like a sculpture. In fact, although he was a few inches taller, his physique resembled that of the late Tookie Williams, the notorious leader of the Crip street gang from South Central Los Angeles, California. Most men in jail and guys like Slim worked out daily, conditioning their bodies to be prepared for the inevitable. Another reason why guys such as Slim trained so hard was to be more capable of effectively assaulting someone and ending the assault quickly. One hitter quitter. I started training and conditioning my body like Slim and many of my counterparts. The school year was nearly over and I continued to attend class as much as I could. As a result of my weight training, a few of the guys and a couple of coaches on the football team tried to recruit me. I was reluctant to do so because I hardly ever went to school, so I thought it would be impossible to participate in a sport. In addition, I was a little hesitant because I did not know them and wondered why they wanted me on their team. Upon the end of the school year, I was informed that I was promoted to the 9th grade. At last, I had finally made it to high school. I was 15 years old and the year was 1997. Although I was behind my peers by 2 grade levels, I was in high spirits to be there. After dropping in and out of school throughout the years, it seemed unthinkable that I would make it to the 9th grade. I had gotten behind by failing to pass the 4th grade twice. When I discovered my mother was smoking crack, I stopped caring about school and everything else. I failed the 4th grade the first time because I rarely attended class. I had to at least come to school in order to have any hope of getting promoted to the next grade. The second time I was retained in the 4th grade was because I did not pass the TCAP, the Tennessee Comprehensive Assessment Program test. Although my brother Charles was only 1 year older than me, he was ahead by 3 grades. Now that I was in high school and sharing the same campus with my older brother and his friends, I was motivated to stick around rather than drop out, despite being homeless. Sadly, Many students set a goal to reach a specific grade level before dropping out rather than aiming to graduate from high school. I joined JROTC, Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps, and became well acquainted with most of the instructors. Some of them learned about my personal life outside of school, but still regarded me as they did everyone else. I appreciated them for it. JROTC was fun, and I really enjoyed being a part of the program. It made me feel like I had a family. In addition, wearing the JROTC uniform every Tuesday served me well because I could not afford clothes for school. Although we were only supposed to wear it once a week, there were times I wore my JROTC uniform twice in the same week. When my peers would ask me why, I would usually respond by saying, "I must have my days mixed up again," and pretend to be disappointed. Occasionally, I stole some of my school clothes from places like Dillard's and JCPenney. At the same time, I was not making a lot of money selling drugs because I was not really applying myself. I did not assert myself or put in the work I normally did to make sales. I was losing my ambition as a hustler. I was broke, and crack sales provided my only income. Now I was depending more on the $54 Medea gave me begrudgingly every month from my welfare check. My interest was torn between paving a way for myself in a life of crime and getting an education. I knew receiving an education would create an opportunity to someday make an honest living, and the school years seemed to fly by quickly. For some vague reason, my brother decided to drop out of school. I was very disappointed when he dropped out permanently, and no one was able to talk him into returning. Of course, with my history of dropping out, I was not in a position to tell him differently. Things grew more challenging in my personal life. The street was starting to weigh heavily on my heart. Moreover, my mom was involved in a few altercations on the block. I was attending class regularly and had stopped hanging out on the corner as much, missing out on potential crack sales. Also, I did not have a steady place to live. As a result, I contemplated dropping out for a third and final time. I went to school and told some of my friends that I would not be coming back. News of this got back to one of my JROTC instructors. When the instructor asked me if I was quitting school again, I responded hesitantly, stuttering, "Yes, sir, I'm quitting." Then he asked me why I wanted to quit school. At that point, I exposed myself completely. I shared everything I was afraid to tell anyone at school with my instructor. I told him I was homeless and that my mother was an addict. I told him I was currently living in a crack whorehouse with several addict prostitutes. I shared what my life had been like since I was 7. I told him that living a life under those circumstances was very challenging, and going to school only added to the burden. He stood there for a moment in silence with a blank stare before he spoke. He said that he understood my situation and admired my perseverance. He proceeded to tell me many sincere things to convince me to stay in school. I was a good kid and he respected me. "Hopefully things will get better for you," he said. Then he said one thing above all that helped me decide not to drop out. "Your life may be hard, and I do not doubt that, but quitting school will only make it harder for you in the long run." I told him how I longed for a permanent place to live. We talked about an all-boys camp that was in the middle of Glendale. One day, my mother and I walked past the camp. When I looked inside the fence, I saw many troubled young men just like myself. I observed the boys playing basketball, lifting weights, and laughing. I told my mother that I would love to go to that camp if it meant that I could be off the street. I thought that I would find shelter there and perhaps some food to eat. I was jubilant about the possibility of no longer being homeless. Then I began to feel bad about leaving my mother behind. Eventually, my thoughts of leaving her diminished because the guilt weighed too heavily on my conscience. At the time, my mother was searching for government assistance and charitable organizations that would be willing to help us. She was rejected and denied repeatedly until someone finally answered her with that long-awaited yes. We were so happy. My mother scheduled an appointment to meet with the agency in Memphis the next day. After the meeting, she informed me that unfortunately we were not accepted because the agency would not accept children. I was amazed at my mother's unfailing love, despite how badly she needed shelter. In the face of all her efforts, she had told them that she could not leave me behind. My instructor informed me that the boys' camp to which I was referring to was actually a juvenile correctional center. I told him that I had eventually discovered the name of the place. In fact, knowing it was a juvenile correctional center, I had even thought about intentionally committing a crime in order to get apprehended by the police and placed there. My reasoning was that at least I would have shelter and food for a little while. The school bell rang. We shook hands and parted ways with the understanding that I would return to school the next day. I thank God for Major Davison for encouraging me to continue my education. I never gave another thought to dropping out of school after our conversation. I continued with school as agreed with a sense of liberation. I believed that one day my education would pay off, as my JROTC instructor suggested. Even with many mishaps, by the end of the school year, I was promoted to the 10th grade. One day after school, I went to the trap to check on my mother and see how she was doing. As I walked down the street, the drug dealers were dealing and the crack addicts were nourishing their cravings. When I saw my mother, she nervously told me that she might have mistakenly sold crack to an undercover cop. When an unfamiliar person wanted to buy crack and the dealers were skeptical of that person, they would get an addict to make the sale. The dealers did this in case the person was an undercover police officer. Mama often got crack from a dealer and sold it on the street. When she sold the crack, she would give the money to the dealer in exchange for crack to smoke. In my mother's case, unfortunately, the guy with the unfamiliar face was an undercover officer. She was soon arrested for distribution of crack cocaine. During her indictment, she was summoned to Allen for a hearing and found guilty of aggravated assault for stabbing Terrence. The two charges ran concurrently, and she was sentenced to umpteen years of imprisonment. With the larger portion of her sentence suspended, coupled with good behavior, she ended up spending less than 4 years in prison. Although I was at peace knowing that she was not out in the street smoking crack, I resented the fact that my mother was incarcerated. During this time, I faced many challenges and arrived at a turning point in my life. I was beginning to grow spiritually and had started pondering positive things to do with my life. My family moved quickly in updating their latest lingo. While my mother was incarcerated, they stopped calling her crackhead and started referring to her as jailbird. I believe their thinking process was wired backwards. Today, I still believe that they are depressed when my mother succeeds, but overjoyed when she fails. Medea, Andrea, James, and their spouses Lauren and Matthew were our faithful antagonists. We could always count on them to do or say something negative about us. I have not in my lifetime witnessed a group of people more jealous, insecure, or hateful as they were. Unlike my loving mother, I hated them unwaveringly. When election time nears, politicians assemble their teams and hold frequent meetings about their agenda. So did the condescending five. Gossiping about my mother was their only agenda. The jail in which my mother was confined was within walking distance from the trap. My first visit to see her in jail was a joyful one. We laughed, hugged, and talked as if she was not even incarcerated. I was very happy to see my mama. I looked her over carefully and told her she looked good. She had gained a little of the weight back she had lost due to her lifestyle. Her eyes were clear and her thoughts were too, now that she was not in a chemically induced state. We did not really discuss why she was in jail because I pretty much knew the whole story. We did discuss how her feet were swelling because of her walking on the concrete floors of the jail. I asked if she needed anything and if she had money on her books, jailhouse financial account. She said she was fine and did not need anything except some cigarettes. I told her I would put some money on her books and buy her a pack from the commissary. My mother introduced me to a couple of her friends, and I greeted them with a polite hello as I smiled. She told her friends that I was her baby, and one of them mumbled something to which my mother replied, "No, you can't have my baby Brandon." For the most part, they seemed to be fair people, despite the fact that they were confined. I saw other inmates having their photos taken with their families, and I asked my mother if she wanted to take a picture too. She told me it cost too much money and not to worry about it. I went over and inquired about the cost of the photo and discovered that one Polaroid photo cost $5. This was in 1999, and many years later it only cost about $3 to get a picture taken in other institutions. We continued talking and our favorite topic of discussion finally came up, as it always did. Our favorite topic was God, and it still is to this day. We shared his teachings generously amongst ourselves. We enjoyed each other's company immensely. After all, we were best friends. She was all I had, and I was all she had. Besides Jesus, there was no one else. It was only Mother and me. It had always been that way since I started living on the street with her. She talked about her withdrawal symptoms and how she was glad to be clean. Our visit was about to end. We embraced one another and walked towards the exit gate. I saw a couple of inmates waiting in line to take pictures with their families. They wore gleaming smiles. I told the photo guy that I would like to have a picture taken as well. I noticed my mother standing slightly behind me with a huge grin affixed to her face. This made me cheerful, and she was too. It was hard being poor, and always being denied even the simplest things in life. My mother and I posed for the photographer, and he captured our bright smiles for the portrait. I offered the picture to my mother, but she insisted I keep it. I left the jail walking, and when I glanced back over my shoulder, I expected to see my mother walking inside. Instead, I saw her standing with her hands gently grasping the chain links of the razor barbed wire fence, staring at me as I walked away. I love that woman so much. I just cannot explain it in words. She has done so much for me. Despite her drug addiction and the abusive relationship she suffered, she is more of a mother than any kid could ever imagine. I thank God for blessing me with His very best. She is my dearest friend, my sister in Christ, and my mother. I waved to her, turned forward, and continued walking. Since my mother was back in jail, it was hard for me to spend the night going from house to house as she did because I was not willing or comfortable to ask people I did not know well for help. Instead, I started spending most of my nights in my shack across the street from Medea's house. I also found shelter several nights in the trap house in the area where blacks and I sold drugs. That was a very dumb move on my part as a criminal. Not only could the police have raided it at any time, but armed cracked out addicts could have burst inside looking for their next fix. I was unaware of the danger that surrounded me, but I did not care. I needed a place to sleep, and that is all I cared about during those moments. By the time I made it to high school, I had survived and experienced more in life than most adults. I felt mature, like an adult, or what some would call an original gangster. I was growing weary of a life filled with violence and crime. I wanted to live the life of a kid. Whenever someone asked my age and I told them, they would comment that I was too mature for my age. So I would tell them, I'm only 15, or whatever age I was at the time, physically, but I'm a 90-year-old man mentally. I was implying that I had lived a harder life and had already experienced more challenges than most do in a lifetime. I was in the 10th grade at 16. I started selling crack and competing with the local drug dealers when I was 13. At that time, my peers were men and women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. I was not able to let my guard down with my peers out there on the street. School served as my safe place. It shielded me from all the madness I dealt with in the street. I did not have to worry about anyone pulling out a gun and blowing out my brains if I said something they did not like. I enjoyed being at peace in school. I did not have to be a gangster there. Soon, I joined the football team, as many of my peers and coaches had encouraged me to do. I loved it. I felt a sense of belonging, like I was a part of a family. I loved interacting with my fellow teammates. In fact, I caused fewer problems in school than the typical student. I never got expelled or suspended. I only had an in-school suspension once for a few days. A close friend pushed me in a chair across the classroom while the teacher was lecturing, and then down the hallway after class ended. We were just goofing off, I suppose. I was involved in only 2 gang fights in nearly a third. That was all the problems I caused in school. Okay, well, I sold a little weed and carried a couple of guns to school, but that was it. I promise. The football preseason practice progressed, and it became intensely harder and harder. The demands the coach laid upon us became very difficult for me to meet. We had to practice twice a day, and at times in the rain. For my teammates, this was wonderful, but for me, it was a nightmare. After practice, I would return to my shabby, abandoned dwelling, soiled with dirt and carrying a stomach ache because I was hungry. As I mentioned before, I did not have running water in my shack and therefore could not bathe. Even if there had been running water, the rust-stained, moldy, and bacteria-infested bathtub was partially sunk into the floor of the bathroom and would have easily fallen onto the ground if I had put one foot inside of it. The flooring in the bathroom was always damp and very unstable, like most of the shack. The odor was like living with a decomposing animal. Completely unbearable. The entire place was cluttered with piles of trash and discarded junk that Medea stored there. The walls and flooring throughout the shack were unstable. Weeds and other rubbish grew out from the cracks and holes in the walls and floors. I attempted to clear out the living room area the best I could manage. I put most of the junk into the rooms where Medea piled the majority of her stuff. I cleaned the living room when I first started living there. The living room was my kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom. I lived in the living room because it was the most sanitary and in better condition than the rest of the house. I was given a foot tub, a round aluminum 4-gallon wash tub to bathe in. The foot tub was very small. It was about 1 foot in diameter and a little over a foot tall. This was my bathtub, and since I didn't have running water in my shack, I asked Andrew for hot water to fill it with. Normally, by the time Andrew brought my foot tub back, The water in it was lukewarm and oftentimes cold. There were many times when I wasn't allowed into Medea's yard, so I couldn't get my foot tub as soon as Andrew prepared it. I had to wait for him to bring it across the street to me. At first, he drew water from their bathtub faucet, but by the time it got to me, it was never hot. Andrew and I ultimately decided on him bringing me the water after he boiled it on the stove in a tea kettle. Medea wouldn't allow him to get any more water, so I had to use what I had. Standing in all of about 2 quarts of water, I began to bathe my soiled body. Water spilled onto the living room floor as I bathed. The winter months were brutal when I stood in the living room, bathing in the foot tub. The freezing cold air blew through the holes and cracks. Living in that shack was much like sleeping on the street corner because the structure provided little to no protection from the elements. While bathing in my foot tub one winter night, I stood there bare and quivering, beaten by winter's wind. I soaped my body with the old rag I used as a washcloth. I credit those occurrences as contributing factors to the constant illnesses I suffered as a child. It was getting dark, so I stepped out of the foot tub after bathing and lit a couple of candles. I lay down in the bed and stared at the ceiling, which was covered with spider webs and black soot stains from all the candles and lamps I had burned over the years. I got out of bed when I heard Andrew's footsteps approaching. I opened the wooden lock that was nailed into the door frame, serving as a door lock so Andrew could come inside. Andrew gave me a sandwich to eat and a cup of water. I thanked him before he left, and I ate the sandwich in 2 or 3 bites. I said my prayers and lay back down to rest for the coming day. Midway through the night, I awoke because my stomach became upset from the egg sandwich. This was also another eye-opening experience I recall vividly. My toilet was more disgusting than the bathtub. There was only a little brownish water in the bowl that remained from when the shack had running water. The toilet's exterior was dingy. It had greenish black stains inside and around its base. There was a large rusty tin barrel filled with rainwater behind the shack. I used the water from there to flush the toilet. I kept a plastic bucket next to the barrel to carry the water inside. When I used the toilet, I squatted and hovered over it, being careful not to touch it. I poured water into the toilet from the bucket, positioning the bucket high enough over the toilet to generate just the right amount of force to flush it. Sometime it worked, sometime it didn't, and when I was unsuccessful, it would overflow onto the floor. I kept my soil bath water from my foot tub to help flush the toilet. For a time, it provided the additional water needed. The imagery from those years makes my stomach queasy. After playing the balancing act over the toilet in the unhealthiest conditions, I pondered for a better way, one that was more humane and less undomesticated. Therefore, I started going outside into the pasture, yards away from my shack, with the cattle to relieve myself. Most of the time, Medea wouldn't give me toilet paper, so I started using leaves and grass from the pasture to clean myself. On the days it rained or during late night when I couldn't see well enough in the pasture, defecating in the middle of my living room was my alternative. I covered a portion of the floor with newspapers, squatted over it, and relieved myself. Afterwards, I folded the newspaper inside of other miscellaneous papers and discarded it. Because of it being too dark outside, I put my discarded waste inside the ceiling of the bathroom. For a while, I went back the next day and threw it out into the woods. Having a lamp was a high privilege for me because it took Medea nearly a year before she decided to let me use 2 of her kerosene lamps. I burned diesel in them because I was told kerosene cost too much. I was very excited to get the lamps because they illuminated my living room a lot better than the candles I had been using. It also made me feel almost like I had electricity. The downside of having the lamps was that whenever I ran out of diesel, it would take a long time before Medea would allow Andrew to buy more. The shack was always the place I knew I could sleep in lieu of sleeping on the street, or at least that's what I thought. There were many nights when I came home to the shack and there would be a lock on the door. I called out loud enough for Andrew to hear me from across the street. Andrew usually walked over and told me, "I'm sorry, Brad, but Medea don't want you to sleep at the shack tonight." I asked him once what was her reason for locking me out of the shack, and he said, "You know how Medea hates you and Jackie, Brad. She hate y'all with a passion. You know that." Whenever this happened, I would sleep on the porch or outside in the pasture. There were many nights I stayed on the street in Memphis, Glendale, and Cherry Hill, but refused to go to sleep like the other bums who slept on the corner. I would sit down on a bucket or whatever I could find and prop myself up against something and fight to stay awake. There were too many occasions where Medea did silly things, and locking the door to the shack was one of them. Another occasion was when I came home after football practice heavily soiled. My body was gripped with dirt, mud clinging to my legs. I looked down in the corner near my bed where I kept my foot tub, but I couldn't find it. I continued to look for it throughout the house. Even though I normally didn't go into other rooms, I desperately hoped to find it there. I continued searching for about a half an hour and decided to give up. Thought to myself when I was searching, I know Medea didn't bring her crazy ass over here and take my damn foot tub. I walked across the street and questioned Andrew. He hadn't seen it. Medea came outside when I was walking back across the street towards my shack and yelled, "Go buy your own damn foot tub. Don't come over here bother me about mine, you ugly bastard." Taking my tub was like taking a homeless man's grocery cart. That foot tub was all I had to bathe in, and I was making the best of it. Much like the grocery cart of a homeless person, having it was essential. Medea really set the bar with that one. She had a knack for digging to lower depths each day. Andrew came across the street and gave me another foot tub, a 2-gallon foot bath to bathe in. This one was even smaller than the one I had before. It was plastic and pink. He brought me some hot water to pour in it so I could bathe. This foot tub disappeared later on that week, and my old aluminum one magically reappeared in the spot where I always kept it. I was happy to get my premium foot tub back. Good grief. There were times when Medea took my lamps and candles and hid them. Whenever she did this, I wouldn't have any light. I overcame this by simply learning to do without it. Andrew, acting as a mediator, convinced Medea to give him the lamps, and he in turn gave them back to me. After that, sometimes I didn't light the lamps because I was so angry with how Medea was treating me. I thought that if I made her think I didn't need the lamps, maybe she would stop taking them. I learned to cope with things like that while struggling to focus on school. In addition to this, Medea starved me most of the time by not allowing me to eat. During that time, Medea received a large sum of food stamps for my siblings and me. She received a monthly check from the government as supplemental welfare support for us too. I struggled internally to become a better person and became more reluctant to sell dope. This also impacted me badly because I no longer had money to buy food when I was hungry. I remembered there was a blueberry orchard within walking distance. I learned of this one summer when several members of the football team and I got jobs there. We were hired to pick blueberries. Later on, I started eating there. I remember many days giving away crack to some of the guys I hustled with. My brother, Charles, and older cousin, Maurice, were included in that number. I looked on as the remainder of my crack dissolved in the sun outside of the shack. I was getting closer to getting out of the drug game completely. I sold crack off and on for a little while sparingly and eventually stopped. I continued selling marijuana because I realized it carried less jail time if convicted. I didn't make much cash selling weed because the profit margin was about 40%. Crack can have a profit margin exceeding 200%. I started Bible studies with some local Jehovah's Witnesses and learned about God. I told my mother about this one day during a visit, and she told me to make sure we read from the King James Bible and never to use their material. She said that there is only one God. I agreed and continued my studies with them from the King James Bible. I began to grow spiritually, and those studies shed light on how illiterate I was. I could hardly read well enough to complete a single sentence without pausing for one of the witnesses to sound out a word for me. This was due to my prolonged absenteeism and years of dropping out of school.